Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Always glad to have in the studio with us Dr. Gary Ostrower, at Alfred University history professor. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for coming in.
Good morning to you.
Well, let's start out with this. Last week we talked Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Those two men, how influential are they today in 2018?
Well, in a lot of ways they're influential, and they were certainly influential in their own time. And, you know, even before I note how influential they are, I want to make the point that these guys were very, very smart. They were very, very well read. Now, granted, you know, they didn't have as much to read back in that earlier period than you do today, but they were fully conversant with the philosophers from France, from England. There were men like a fellow named Thomas Hutchinson, another by the name of David Hume. These were, you know, top-notch philosophers, political philosophers. They had a lot to do with shaping the politics of the 18th century, the 1700s. Jefferson had read them. Adams had read them. And in a sense, they took the insights of these men and they applied it to American politics. Jefferson is called, I think correctly, the father of American liberalism. He was the leading liberal of his time. Just right behind him was James Madison, who was terribly influential in writing our Constitution. But generally speaking, you know, Madison was still, so to speak, in Jefferson's shadow. By the same token, Adams, who was not a particularly popular person, came from the middle class, was not a very good political campaigner. I think in some ways was a little bit, how shall I put it, you know, kind of uncomfortable with crowds and whatnot. But he had thought a lot about politics, and he thought a lot about the importance of executive power. Adams was much, much more sympathetic to a strong executive than Jefferson was. As a matter of fact, Adams, I think I mentioned this last week in our program, Adams wanted a president for life, not an elected president, but a president for life, so that the president wouldn't be subject to the whims of Congress or certainly of the public. Adams wanted to elevate the importance of the presidency and also of the vice presidency by the titles that these people had, by the way in which they carry themselves, the kinds of clothes that they wore. I mentioned, for instance, that Adams, when he was vice president, attended every single meeting of the United States Senate during that period. And he attended those meetings because, after all, the vice president of the United States, according to our Constitution, is the president of the Senate. Okay, he breaks the ties if there's a vote there. Adams would show up at every one of those Senate sessions, and he would be carried there in a carriage that was drawn by 6 horses, and those 6 horses were outfitted in all sorts of royal regalia. So, you know, yeah, I think that we owe something to Adams in respect to the degree to which our president is a stronger president today than it had been, let's say, in 1789 or 1787. When the Constitution was first drafted. But I guess there's one other point I would make. Both of these guys feared democracy with a small d. Both of them had a real they understood some of the limitations of democracy. That was even more true of Adams than it was of Jefferson. John Adams would be horrified if he was at a Trump rally. He would be horrified to hear people saying, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. For John Adams, that's not what the American system involved. Okay? That's what you do in European dictatorships. That's what you do in the Philippines or maybe in Venezuela. But you don't do that in the United States. The way in which, in other words, our President Trump is, you know, gearing up, kind of, gearing up the crowds to, to believe things that are absolutely not true. That too would have horrified Adams. Adams and Jefferson were extremely honest. Okay, they went out of their way. Did they ever lie? I suppose they did, but they were very, very honest individuals. The idea that you'd have someone like Trump who lies repeatedly, who may be pathologically a liar, has lied, 3,000 to 4,000 times that we know, that we've been able to document. I think that Adams and Jefferson would be rolling over in their respective graves if they saw what was happening today.
The idea of booing the media, which you see happen a lot to CNN at a Trump event, Did that ever happen to the newspapers in the Founding Fathers' day? Would that have ever happened that a media outlet, which would have been a newspaper in those days, was so unpopular?
Yeah, well, perhaps. It's an interesting question you're asking. The political press, the press generally, during the 1790s and into the early 1800s, was probably the most political press that we have ever had, certainly at least until cable television. And the stuff that those presses, that the Democrats on one side, they were called the Democratic Republicans. That was Jefferson's party. The Federalists was Adams' party. So there were Federalist newspapers and there were Democratic Republican newspapers, and they were vicious. And both both of these presidents were very, very conscious of that, and in some ways very uneasy with that. There were moments at which Jefferson, for instance, tried to tone down some of what Jeffersonian newspapers were saying about Adams and were saying about the Federalists. Would they have gotten the public into booing? Well, it may be an irrelevant question because the public really was not that involved in a popular sense yet with presidential elections. It wasn't real until 1824 and 1828 and 1832 when Andy Jackson became a major political figure that the number of people who were voting really expanded. And that was because until the 1820s, there was a property qualification. Okay, you had to own a certain amount of property, you had to pay a certain amount in property taxes in order to vote. And that really kept the size of the electorate down. In addition to which, women did not vote at all. In addition to which, black people did not vote at all. So you really had a surprisingly small number of people who were involved in the political process.
When we talked a moment about the press getting booed and things getting a little out of hand at meetings, what about the whole thing of dueling? How did that get into the political system, where it would either be swords, sometimes handguns? What was that about?
Well, it was a way to settle scores. As a matter of fact, dueling was going out of fashion at just about the time that Adams was president. He became president in 1797, and then 4 years later, he lost an election to Jefferson. So Jefferson served from 1801 until 1809. Dueling was going out of fashion. As a matter of fact, dueling had already become illegal in New York State by 1800. So in that very famous duel between Aaron Burr on one hand and Alexander Hamilton on the other, they dueled not in New York where they lived, but they dueled in New Jersey because it was illegal in New York.
The one name that comes up a lot, he's after the American Revolution, but is the French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville. And he's held up by a lot of philosophical types in America, I guess. I'd say history majors, philosophy majors. They talk about him a lot. Is there, you talked at the beginning about Adams and Jefferson. Is there an American version of de Tocqueville that other countries, England, France, Italy, whoever, would hold up? Would they ever say Thomas Jefferson once said this, or George Washington wrote this, or I don't know, any philosophers from America? Do the Europeans do that the way we would do with their philosophers?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question you're asking me, but there were American writers who were often referred to in and quoted in Europe, and I think the two best examples of that during that earlier period were Benjamin Franklin, who was known as a scientist, he was known as a political thinker, he was extremely well known in Europe, he was very popular, I might add, in France, not so much in Great Britain. I might also add that John Adams hated, and I really mean hated, that's a strong word, he hated Benjamin Franklin. But these guys were, commenters, they commented on American politics. Now, they also commented on European politics. By the same token, de Tocqueville, who was French, came to the United States. He toured here for a couple of years back in the 1830s, and he would eventually write a book called Democracy in America. And, I tell my students to this very, very day, That remains the best single book about American politics ever written. One of the two most important books about American politics ever written, in part because it was so very, very influential. And if you ask me what that other book was, again, it's a book that was written back in that earlier period. It's really not a book. It's a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, about 75 different essays written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and also a New Yorker by the name of John Jay. And if you read these things, you can get a great deal of insight into American politics from the 1790s right until our own day. One of the things that Hamilton says in one of the most famous of these Federalist Papers, is called Federalist Paper number 1, is that watch out for people who fly the flag. Watch out for people who use patriotism as a way of camouflaging their own immorality, their own willingness to corrupt the system.
You know, Kennedy gave a speech like that shortly before he died, and in fact, recently, as far back as 6 months ago, Robert Kennedy Jr., who's on a radio show we have on the weekends called Ring of Fire on Saturday nights, quoted that writing, and he talked about getting crowds stirred up, and often there's a corrupt influence behind it.
Well, I would agree that it's something that we had to deal with.
The demagogue type.
Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what demagoguery is, and that's precisely what Hamilton was warning against. And, you know, I mean, Hamilton, again, he was not a Democrat any more than, you know, Adams was a Democrat. When I talk about a Democrat, I mean democracy with a small d. They didn't want to involve the common people. They didn't believe that people were well enough educated to really understand politics. And every so often, even in our own period, we raise the question, should a person who is illiterate, should a person who has not ever gone to school have the right to vote? And I think that most of us are comfortable in saying yes, but we do so with some uncertainty. We know very well that people sometimes vote in ways that are really rather uneducated. And I might add one more thing along those lines, and that is that in that early period, the people who voted for the most part were people who were propertied, and they were also well educated. But by the 1830s, that's no longer the case. By the 1830s, all these property qualifications disappear. And as a result of that, the number of American males who are going to participate in the political process becomes much, much larger, so that the number of Americans who are going to vote in 1828 doubled the number who voted in 1824. And that number will double again by 1832. So how do you get these people, how do you get all these new people involved? How do you get them kind of revved up? And the answer is that you're going to wind up turning politics into entertainment. So they had parades, they had bonfires, they had rallies, they had all kinds of things that would, kind of entertain people, get them to vote for their own candidate, give them jobs. We call that the spoils system. We'll give them jobs, we'll give their friends jobs, we'll give their parents jobs or whatnot. And the idea is that, the public will follow along. That's not a very, very good prescription for an educated electorate.
Having a very interesting conversation today with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Gonna take a break, check the forecast. We'll be back.
I just looked quickly to see who was texting me. I never text and drive.
I was just changing my music. My eyes never left the road, I swear.
He was just there. He came out of nowhere in the middle of the block. Is he gonna be okay?
Drivers and pedestrians, see and be seen. The instant you stop paying attention could be the instant you'll always regret.
A message from the Governor's Traffic Safety Committee and the New York State Departments of Health and Transportation.
Checking in now with meteorologist Gary Best, who says it's going to be pretty rainy today.
Yeah, we're looking at some showers and thunderstorms out there today, Brian. Good morning. We've got some showers and storms right now. The heaviest is off to the north and northeast of us. This morning, sunrise at 6:10. The sun will set at 8:22. We'll see some partial sun between the clouds during today. On and off showers and maybe a thunderstorm or two near 85, so still very warm and humid. Tonight may be a shower, 65 to 70 overnight. Another round of showers and storms coming through on Wednesday. Some could be locally heavy. Temperatures near a bit over 80. Then we dry out a bit. Partial clearing, low 60s on Wednesday night. And Thursday, sun and clouds, a little bit drier, about 80 to 85, and it looks nice on Friday as well, Brian.
We're back with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, I mentioned President Kennedy, and he gave some sort of speech shortly before he died about the demagogue getting crowds all excitable about some cause or another, almost like the Music Man, you got trouble in River City kind of thing. Kennedy is only recently being respected by the conservatives, and that's because of Larry Kudlow, who before he got a job with the Trump administration wrote a book about JFK's tax policies and compared it to Reagan and had a lot of high words of praise for JFK. President Nixon in the Watergate tapes talked about how he wanted to tie the Kennedy legacy to Chappaquiddick. And I think, at least with a lot of conservatives, Nixon was very successful in doing that.
Well, I think to a certain extent he was. But, when we talk about Chappaquiddick, we're really talking about not so much Jack Kennedy, but we are talking about Edward Kennedy, of course. And look, the fact of the matter is that Jack Kennedy was a middle-of-the-road Democrat. He was a centrist. He wasn't on the far left. He wasn't on the far right, although in the way in which we redefine politics by today, he seems more left than perhaps he was at that time. But one thing that he did do, I mean, I think, again, I mentioned this in an earlier program.
He being Ted Kennedy?
No, I'm sorry, Jack Kennedy.
John Kennedy, okay.
Taxes, the highest tax rate, the highest marginal tax rate in the United States when Kennedy became president in 1961 was about 89%, almost 90%. There was a recession in 1992. Kennedy argued that if we cut taxes, we can put people back to work. Well, they did cut taxes. It meant that there was more money flowing around. This was traditional Keynesian economics, named after John Maynard Keynes, the British economist. And, of course, it meant that the federal government was able to stimulate the economy by putting more money into circulation. President Trump would argue much the same thing when he was running for president in 2016, that if you cut taxes, we're going to create jobs. The problem was that we weren't in a recession in 2016 or 17, or for that matter, in 2018. And so the tax cuts are not really putting people back to work. We were putting people back to work under Obama beginning in 2012 and 2013, and that has continued under President Trump. So give both of these guys credit for, maintaining a very, very vigorous economy. But today, the tax cuts of 2017 have gone 83 or 84% of them have gone into the pockets of the 1%. They've gone into the pockets of the people who are now using it for stock buybacks. They are using it for investment for their own purposes. They are not using it to create jobs. So while our unemployment rate is about as low as it's been in a long, long time, it's not a product of the tax cuts. It's a product of an economic recovery that has been underway for at least 8 years at this point.
President Kennedy and President Eisenhower and civil rights. The Arkansas situation, or was that President Eisenhower?
That was Eisenhower.
Okay, that's the Brown versus Board of Education.
Two things there. One was Brown versus Board of Ed. In 1954, the Supreme Court, led by a liberal Republican by the name of Earl Warren, who had been a candidate, I might add, for president in 1952 when Eisenhower was a candidate for president, that is for the Republican nomination. Eisenhower appointed Warren to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And in 1954, Warren was able to get the court, had enough persuasion with other justices to enunciate what we call the Brown versus Board of Ed decision, which essentially rendered legal segregation unconstitutional. Eisenhower himself had some doubts about this, but he was first a man who understood the value of law, that is to say that the rule of law first counted. And consequently, he fully supported Warren in what Warren did. This came to a head in 1958, 4 years later, in Little Rock, Arkansas, when the governor of Arkansas wanted to, and rather successfully, had maintained segregation of the Little Rock schools, and Eisenhower said, "You cannot do this. It's a violation of the rule of law. It's a violation violation of the Supreme Court decision of 1964 and a follow-up in 1965. And as a result, he sent the 101st Airborne, he sent 4,000 federal marshals, he sent the FBI, and he nationalized the National Guard of Little Rock. I'm sorry, he didn't send all those people. Some of that would come a little bit later in Oxford, Mississippi. But the point here is that Eisenhower nationalized the National Guard, and he guaranteed that the schools of Little Rock would be desegregated.
And President Kennedy was butting heads with Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett, who I have to mention, Newsmaker host Kevin Doran had Ross Barnett on the radio when Kevin was working in Mississippi, and Kevin used to write civil rights editorials at the time in Mississippi, and he went out of his way to make a fool out of Barnett when Barnett was on the air. But tell us about JFK and Barnett.
Well, it was a similar situation to what Eisenhower had done in Little Rock. And when I mistakenly said that Eisenhower had said 4,000 marshals and the FBI and the 101st Airborne, that was Kennedy sending them to Oxford, Mississippi to desegregate the University of Mississippi. You know, it's interesting. Today we watch Southeastern, football. We see, schools like Mississippi and Mississippi State, Alabama, Louisiana State, and so forth. These schools have football teams that are about 75% black. Back in that period of 1952, there was not one single black football player on any of these teams. All these schools were segregated. And the desegregation begins with Eisenhower and continues with Kennedy, and then, most importantly, with Lyndon Johnson, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Give all three of these presidents credit for essentially representing, in a sense, making good on the promise of the Declaration of Independence and the promise of the Gettysburg Address.
And final question, did MLK make JFK make things happen faster as far as civil rights go, or is that true for all three presidents?
Oh, I think it was true. I think it was, well, to a certain extent, for all three presidents. But it was especially true, I think, of JFK. After King was he was jailed. He was arrested, and it was Kennedy who called King's widow. Eventually his widow, his wife, and it was also Kennedy who sent the federal marshals to protect what were called the Freedom Riders, who were desegregating transportation facilities across the entire South in the period when Kennedy was still president.
Dr. Ostrower, we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for coming in.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. Another history lesson.
AM 1480 WLEA Hornell.